Yeah, no, we wanted to give a disclaimer that it's a little hard to understand hate speech without specifically talking about it. So there might be conversations that might come up that might involve profane languages, but we will try to minimize that as much as possible. So yeah, I'm gonna now perhaps hand it over to Chris to give a little introduction about the Sentinel project and how and why Hatebase came into being.
Sure. So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. The Sentinel project is an NGO focused on assisting communities that are threatened by mass atrocities. And within that mission, we have two pillars, one being direct cooperation with the people in harm's way, and the other being the innovative use of technology to support, whatever kinds of efforts at prevention and mitigation seem to work in a given situation. We're very flexible in terms of, what does assistance mean? What does cooperation mean? What is technology and innovation? Because we always look at a given situation and try to understand the drivers of the risk of violence and then work backwards from there in terms of what can help to reduce that risk of violence and then what tools are available and appropriate in a given context. So with that being said, of course, there are a few different things that we do, which always sort of, which we find to be broadly applicable. And one of those is hate speech monitoring. As I'm sure a lot of people will know, issues like genocide and mass atrocities don't happen simply overnight. They're the result of typically long-term processes with perpetrators that are preparing to attack a particular group of people. And one of those processes very often is dehumanizing those people to make them seem like more legitimate targets for violence, and then ultimately inciting violence, actually inciting people to go attack a given group. And so hate speech is potentially a useful warning indicator. And that's why we developed Hatebase, basically to be a data source that could help ourselves and other organizations to look at, basically to help to try to quantify the risk of that kind of violence happening in different places. So I think I'll leave the explanation at that because of the further details of how Hatebase works and that sort of thing will come out from this point onward. But yeah, it's just important to understand that this is basically a data source that we see as potentially useful in violence prevention initiatives, but it's also open and available for basically anyone else to use for their own purpose as well.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm just going to continue with what Chris was saying. So we advocate for with effectively a monitoring tool to actually see what kind of hate is really out there. And our API is transitioning and is going to be open source very soon, which is available for companies, government agencies, NGOs, and research organizations to use it for their research purposes, for localized insults. We also have around 1,000 terms that in 98 different languages. And the idea is that we're trying to look at online hate speech as an early warning predictor for regional violence, which is primarily what we do at the Sentinel project. So there isn't exactly a universally accepted definition of hate speech, which is perhaps there's a lot of disparities in understanding. There's a lot of cultural nuance, social nuance. The people from the global north have a very different understanding of what hate speech is, and it's very different in the south. So how we defined it is primarily because of a better way for us to be able to monitor it. We do automate our hate speech terms and have a backend team that also, like, a human moderation element of it. So this is how we define it. We look at any expression regardless of offensiveness, which broadly categorizes a specific group of people based on ethnicity, nationality, religion, class, disability, and sexuality. And the reason why we've removed offensiveness from the definition is because it allows us to have an unbiased and less opinionated version of hate speech. But we also have a different offensiveness category in our platform because we know that the social situation is constantly evolving and changing across the world. I don't know why my screen share ended. I'm going to try sharing again. Can you see my screen?
No, I can't see anything.
Yeah, no.
Is it possible if one of you could share it, and then since I'm having issues with sharing my screen?
Sure, I can give it a try. Although the problem might not be from your side, it may be more to do with the platform.
Yeah, no, I'm having difficulty with sharing it, so it might be nice if one of you all could share it.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see how to do that. I'm not familiar with the screen sharing. Maybe Drew knows better.
Yeah, I can't seem to share my screen. I think maybe it's because I'm not the presenter.
I do see. I'm really sorry about this, everyone, but yeah, I'm not just unable to share my screen at the moment. And maybe it seems like Chris is attempting to do it. I can see the presenter symbol there.
Okay, sure. Let me give it a. Oh, I see it now. Is that working?
I can see something rolling. Yes, I can.
Okay.
Okay, great. So I was on number 5.
This one?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll perhaps go a little bit to the history of hate speech. We also have a lot of international organizations that didn't necessarily have online hate speech, and there's also, until very recently, there's no universally accepted definition of hate speech. And also the way, if we look back at some of the incidents of genocide in Rwanda or Cambodia or Nazi Germany, it required a lot of institutional infrastructure to come together, and a lot of resources and financial capital to be able to push for a particular narrative or a propaganda. But now the situation is really different. You just need a good internet connection and a cheap mobile phone to be able to target and pinpoint towards the audience that you want to do. So the situation is very different now. Next slide, please. We at Hatebase don't necessarily support the censorship or the criminalization of hate speech. We are fundamentally trying to understand the relationship between online speech with the online world, and we also feel that sometimes you kind of reinforce the beliefs of people if you kind of boot someone off the platform, and you don't necessarily remove the hate but just the expression that's used online, and it can have a negative effect. And also we're unsure whether it really leads to us kind of working towards and advocating for a more just society. That being said, we also think that online communities have legal responsibility to moderate user activity to ensure fair, respectful treatment of all users. And they're also allowed to quarantine your content if they find it unnecessary based on the standards that they have internally. And also a lot of we've seen a lot of examples, particularly in the global south, where a lot of discriminatory content is labeled as hate speech to silence particular groups or voices. So we think that hate speech should be allowed, and content should be allowed, of course, within parameters of whether it actually is responsible for coordinating or inciting offline violence. Next slide, please. So how do we work towards tackling online hate speech without infringing on our freedom of speech? So we firstly operate very transparently, which is our platform is, as I mentioned, solely going open source. We also are huge advocates of education and counter messaging in fight fiction environments. We work a lot in conflict zones in Pan Africa, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and a few other parts of the world where information is not freely available. And we also look at independent research and analysis. We work with a number of organizations across the world, 350 universities, Harvard, Stanford, Yale. Our API was also recently used for a report to figure out the number of online abuses against women during the Ugandan elections. We're also slowly also being taught as a curriculum at some universities across the US. And of course, we also move at working towards with government and non-government entities for informed policymaking so that all of the resources can be effectively used in impacted populations. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as we mentioned, we have 98 languages across 178 countries and work in 350 universities. Next slide. Yeah, I think, maybe we could go ahead with. Yes, maybe I could talk about the challenges, some of the technical challenges that we perhaps do counter across with having a broad coverage since we automate hate speech. We've also seen that human moderation has been very challenging because of the sheer volume of online content at the moment. Human moderation is also mentally takes a toll on you, especially imagine 12 hours of looking at pictures and heinous content online of sexual violence or genocide in general. So we've also realized that automating has a few advantages. It's a little more accurate. It also might be a bit more cost effective given that most of the human moderators are also poorly paid. So we found that automation is a better step in terms of monitoring our content. And also, there's also an issue with linguistic coverage. Since we are trying to monitor 90 plus languages, having strong linguistic coverage has also been a massive challenge. Next slide, please. Yeah, maybe I'll hand it over to my colleague Drew, who'll talk a little bit about the platform and how we use our sentiment analysis.
Sure. So actually, Chris, if you could go to the next slide. Pardon me for the rather complicated diagram, but complicated things sometimes require complicated explanations. I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. The way Hatebase is meant to work is essentially to trawl through online content on a rather massive scale, and it is going to reference the 3,800 terms in 98 different languages to pull relevant sightings of what it suspects is hate speech. From that, there is a secondary system that we call Hate Brain, which actually uses sentiment analysis. I think we just lost the screen share, but that's okay. It will essentially use something called sentiment analysis, which is the computer science version of training a computer to understand human language. It does this by breaking down words into and sentences into smaller components, and then weighing what those smaller components mean and generating an outcome estimation of what it thinks the likelihood of something, a particular sentence, phrase, or word is hate speech or not. And it doesn't say yes or no. It's not a binary choice. It will actually generate sort of a percentage output. So there's a 100% and 0% and everything in between as a way of estimating, well, does the computer essentially think this is hate speech? Now, Raashi mentioned that this is a system that's going open source, and we're quite happy to announce that precisely for reasons of academic research, as well as open access and transparency. And a portion of, so the API, the application programming interface that users can interact with will be augmented to a much more open data source. So people are able to actually access the source code as we take our next steps. The next steps are going to focus more on training the computer algorithms to better understand language and to better understand context. And we do that through artificial intelligence algorithms. And it's important, as Raashi had mentioned earlier, for the sake of transparency, to allow others to review this information. So the source code, the data sets will all be in due time made publicly available. This will allow researchers and others to have access to the information, to test the systems on their own, and apply some more scientific rigor to the outputs that are being generated. And from this, we hope to have a better sense through multiple arrays of research how effective the system is, how it can be improved, and what shortcomings it might have.
Thanks, Joe. Perhaps, Chris, you could go on to the next slide. Or maybe can we have the poll questions now possible, Musa? Maybe we'll give each to each polling question will take 1 minute, so you can input your answers. Musa, maybe we can move on to the next question. Yeah, I think Noren says that maybe we could flag certain spaces as hateful so people could make the choice not to engage with them or enter them. Thanks, Noren, for your response. Next question, please, Musa. Maybe we could go to the next question. Okay. Musa, I'm unable to see the first two responses. Is it possible to see them? It says this is to. It says multiple stakeholders. Or maybe you could just put. Yes, we can. But Musa, before that, I can't see the answers properly. So because it says yes, sometimes people, is it possible if we can see the entire sentence? And once we can see the answers, maybe then we can move on to the fourth question. No, we can only see the first few words of some of the responses. I'm not sure if that's only me or if that's also with Chris and Andrew.
Yeah, I can see the answers, but they're cut off. The second and
Yeah.
or the third and fourth are cut off.
Yeah. If that's not a possibility, then maybe we could move on to the fourth question. But I'd like to see the entire response than just the first three words. Yeah, I wasn't aware of the character count, but yeah, I've put the question on the chat as well. So please feel free to um, answer on the chat as well. We'd like to hear from you. Musa, you can perhaps present the answers here, and we'll wait for another minute for everyone to answer the last question on chat. Thanks, Musa. But if we, to answer Gus's question, but the idea is that if we do ban the hateful term, we're not banning the speech, but we're just removing the expression that denotes speech. So, in terms of an effectiveness, it does kind of have a more reinforcing belief of the people who usually circle around in the conspiracy theory realms, right?
Also, to wade into this from another angle, I think a lot of people conflate the concept of freedom of speech and social media expression, where it doesn't necessarily exist, or at least the rights are not the way they are often expressed. As a private company, for example, Facebook is allowed to set pretty broad terms of service, which would allow it to, for example, if they didn't want you to use the letter E, that would be an absurd but perfectly legal limitation that they could place on their service. As a private company and a service provider, the issue comes into play with free speech when it is punishment, usually by government or society at large in a legal sense. And so while we can have a very strict term of service, as people have mentioned before, you can ban that from Facebook. Facebook could have a rule that says no contentious or political discussions whatsoever. You can only share cat pictures, and that would be legitimate in the sense that it is not truly violating anybody's rights in, I think, any country in the world. However, as other people have mentioned, it wouldn't actually be addressing the issue. And in some cases, it may actually exacerbate it by pushing people to more obscure or more extreme platforms where those ideas are encouraged to be expressed and even celebrated, which sort of creates a silo or a separate community in which you have a very localized and a very centralized concept of speech that isn't a free exchange of ideas. It's an echo chamber, and it is self-reaffirming, which could actually generate a stronger movement to express those ideas which are otherwise banned on other popular platforms. So that's one way that we at Sentinel Project and through the Hatebase project are trying to better understand hate speech rather than broad bans or content restrictions, because as things are available to view, we can make assessments and assumptions. When those opinions start to be driven underground, they are a lot harder to analyze.
Thanks, Joe. maybe we could move on to Chris. Maybe you could try sharing your screen again.
Yes, I think. Okay, I see now. I've taken over as presenter again. Okay, just tell me which slide you want.
The one that goes on. Yeah, I think how can you help? Yeah, so I could perhaps summarize some of the past conversations we've had so far. See, as I mentioned, some of the challenges are having a broad linguistic coverage, and of course, a lot of our biases also creep in because, for example, I'm based out of India, my team's in Canada. So, how do we increase that linguistic coverage and get the social and cultural nuance that is required to be able to effectively monitor localized hate speech? Also, there's also a technical challenge when it comes to monitoring hate speech because every platform is different. Facebook is a lot more closed, so it's slightly difficult to monitor. And we typically monitor publicly available conversations, whereas Twitter is more open and broad, so it's slightly easier to monitor. But yeah, so our data set, as you mentioned, is open for others, NGOs, researchers to use freely. And since we are more global in scope, if you can perhaps move to the next slide, Chris. We have introduced the Citizen Linguist Lab, which is basically a crowd source vocabulary where anyone from across the world can update terms and lexicons. Earlier we used to have a sign-up platform and option, but now we're slowly moving open source because we want to we want to make sure that it's the least path of resistance. We also, of course, de-anonymize all of your personally available data that is attributed while contributing, and we wanted to make sure that we're as transparent as possible. So the way we categorize it is based on ethnicity, religion, languages. This is also a map of some of the commonly found hate speech terms. And we'd also often find challenges in how do we define what is offensive in one language and in one context compared to the other. For example, something that's offensive in Egypt or Libya might not be offensive in Lebanon. Similarly, if you want the English that the British English, something that might be offensive in the UK might not be in America or Canada. I come from India, where my Hindi has over 20 different dialects. So yeah, it's very nuanced. So that's also a challenge that we have, and we believe that with the categorizations, we make it easier for you to be able to update the terms. We also allow you to cite any sources that you have that you can give us more context about, and we're looking at terms that are commonly used, not popularly seen in movies or overheard on the radio. We also allow you to. There are also a lot of associated terms that come with hate speech called pilot fish, and maybe Drew, you want to perhaps expand a little bit on that?
Sure. So to delve a little bit further into the inner workings of Hatebase, the system is designed around a sort of a reference library of hate speech terms. It is one of the largest multilingual repositories of hate speech terms available, and we're always seeking to expand it, hence the Citizen Linguist Lab. When the system is basically trawling for terms, phrases, sentences, that sort of thing, on social media platforms, other publicly available APIs, what it is doing is taking terms and using it in and evaluating it in situ, in context, rather than, if somebody quotes a hateful word in a clinical context, it is able to a certain degree to understand that it is a clinical context or a quote, rather than just say, okay, this word appeared here, it must be hate speech. So this is part of the calculation in better understanding the sentiment behind text or language on the internet. Another element of it is what we call pilot fish, which are essentially a sort of fish that swims with larger sea mammals. And so they're sort of accompanying terms to hate speech. They are accelerators or incendiary terms that are not themselves hate speech, but can also give a good sense of when something is being used in a more clinical context or is being used in a inflammatory context. So other profanity is a good example. In multiple languages, that profanity is often an accelerator. And in addition to that, there are other terms which might be themselves not even in inflammatory language, but might be implying inferiority or superiority of ideas or people. Those are all used as aggravating factors in the sentiment analysis of Hatebase. As we move forward to implement more robust machine learning algorithms, it is important that we collect many of those pilot fish terms, those incendiary or associated terms. And the advantage of a lot of machine learning algorithms is that they are able to make those, to deduce those trends and those associations much better than humans are on a large amount of data. And ultimately it does come down to just a vast amount of data, which is not human manageable or possible to be moderated entirely by humans. So the idea is to have this system where the hate speech that is being gathered by the system is ultimately given one final review or given consistent oversight by human review and human moderation, but doesn't necessarily require human moderation in the data collection and initial analysis, which allows the human moderation element to be reduced significantly. And so that's how pilot fish work in the current system and how we expect them to work in the developing system. And again, to come back to something that Raashi had mentioned, is that this is all in many ways research oriented. We don't want to act like we know the answers. In many ways, we are working on these systems to help discover answers, to find things that do work, to find things that don't work, and to better understand the systems, which is why we don't generally position Hatebase as a tool for final moderation or filtering of content, precisely because we understand that there are limitations to the system that we want to better understand before it ever goes into any sort of active role online, in our personal lives, in social media, or anything like that. So it's always important for us to express that this is essentially a research component or a research project, more than it is a finished project or a finished product that will go about filtering, or indeed should go about filtering other people's content.
Thanks, Joe. Maybe you can also look at the questions that that Gus put up. Is it even possible to use sentiment analysis to identify hate speech without human review? We do evaluate everything. We do have human moderators whenever a term is updated, and Drew might be able to add more to that.
Yeah. So part of the next stages in the Hatebase process is to provide sentiment analysis at a significant enough level to filter out things like sarcasm or metaphors at a high enough level where it is functional. This isn't to say that we will have a system or expect to have a system that is, perfect or near perfect. We want to have a tool which is effective, and so we will be basically working towards that. And also, I'd like to point out as a research component, the finding of something not being possible is also a valid finding. We try to apply tools with Sentinel Project. We try and apply new technologies and tools that we think will make systems more efficient and effective, and that isn't always successful. And so part of this is a process of understanding and trying to get a better sense of whether these tools are effective. And just to Gus, to just answer your last question, so we're looking at n-grams as part of the way that basically the whole sentence structure is broken down. So it breaks down a whole sentence into words, and then words into portions, n-grams, and is analyzing each component of a word, and then a word within the elements of a word, and then the word within a sentence, and then the sentence within a broader context.
I believe Gus has another question in chat.
Whether these tools are effective feels like it doesn't have enough finesse as a question. How about when these tools are effective? Well, again, when is an open question. It might be, and I mean, personally, my sense is that there's a lot of faith put into machine learning and artificial intelligence as just a sort of assumption that eventually it will reach a point where it's good enough. And to me, that's not an obvious outcome. So it's important to, it feels like the important thing to emphasize about your tool to people looking to use it is use this at the point where you are beginning to identify. Yes, so we're always trying to include researchers and other academics. The fact that we'll be making open source will make that much easier for people to access. There's a lower barrier to entry, and we'll be able to apply a bit more of a scientific process. If you can think of it in the scientific sense, we might be, the first study that would suggest this, but there requires additional study, and the same methods have to be testable and repeatable. And if they're not, then that does raise an issue with whether this is actually a valid component. And so this is certainly core to what we're trying to work towards, not as a tool that is, we can confidently say, yes, this will filter hate speech or anything like that, to say nothing to get into the larger questions of whether that's right or good, but just to better understand the tools, the systems, the ecosystem, to try and find our best way forward.
Thanks, Drew. Maybe we could move on to the next slide, Chris. So these are some of the priority languages that we're actually looking at. Most of them are Indian languages and around South Asia, and some of them are from Ethiopia, but we're also open to adding more than 98 languages. So if there's a language that you do see on our platform that's not currently available, please feel free to reach out to me. I will put in my contact details and let me know if there's a language that you'd like to add or a different dialect that's not particularly available on our system at the moment. The next slide, please. Yeah, Chris, I'll perhaps hand it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, the slides are jumping around there a bit. Just one, we have limited time, so I'm going to try and take just 1 or 2 minutes to talk about this, but we feel it's important to also highlight the relationship between misinformation and hate speech. These are both topics that get a lot of attention these days, rightfully so, but they're still often discussed as completely separate phenomena. And it's true that they are discrete phenomena. They're different things, but at the same time, they're closely related. And there's often quite a bit of overlap between the two of them. We've seen, both in practice and also hypothetically, we can think of a lot of examples that are fairly ambiguous and are hard to categorize. For example, if somebody is expressing hostility towards a particular group of people, but in doing so, they're also sharing false information about that group of people to justify their hostility. The question becomes, is that misinformation or hate speech? Or looked at, conversely, if somebody is sharing false information, but not in a sort of objective, so to speak, manner where they're just reporting information, but also then making sort of, negative value judgments about the subject of that misinformation. Is that hate speech or misinformation? So I think we need to understand kind of, the distinctions and the subtleties, and then the relationship between these two things. And especially not just the relationship between misinformation and hate speech, but also between misinformation, hate speech, and physical violence that happens offline. And the sort of hypothetical view of these things that we have right now is that very often, hate speech in and of itself, with the exception of specific incitement to violence, hate speech in and of itself doesn't necessarily serve a triggering function for physical violence, but it can serve a preparatory function by encouraging hostility towards a potential target group, by making violence towards a certain group seem more acceptable or even desirable. But someone who's just, reading sort of negative things or hateful things about a particular group on any given day doesn't necessarily spontaneously, pick up a weapon and go to attack them. However, when a piece of misinformation comes into that sort of already hateful context, that hateful atmosphere where people have been prepared, you could say, in that sense, because it can actually have that triggering effect, because what we have found is that misinformation typically is focused around, claims or accusations of real world threats and things like that. So if somebody is accustomed to always hearing, group X is a threat, group X, we need to deal with them or what have you, and then they suddenly, one day hear a rumor that group X is currently, engaged in some kind of threatening activity, or they're about to attack your community or something like that, then that's much more likely to sort of prompt people to take actions, to take action, basically, to take matters into their own hands. So again, this is a fairly hypothetical view that we have of things. We think that, however, that it really warrants further research, and then particularly, has a lot of value in the early warning realm, because if we can monitor these two things effectively, and we can establish a relationship between them and understand some of these nuances, and then establish a relationship with, again, physical violence, there's a lot of value there. But we're quite, keeping in mind that we only have a few minutes left, we're quite interested to hear what other people think of this, either during this session or afterwards, if you want to contact us and discuss it further. So I'll leave it at that, Raashi.
Thanks, Chris. Maybe we go on to our last slide. I guess there's one more slide after this, right, Chris?
Yes, there it is. It just showed up.
Yes. So
Oh,
yeah.
I see. Yes, this one, I guess I will just say one more thing, because I had neglected to mention our sort of famous quote. This we can actually attribute to Drew. It sums up quite well. As you can see, it says, hate speech loads the gun, but misinformation pulls the trigger. I think this is a good sort of metaphorical way of explaining the dynamic that I was just trying to get at.
Thanks, Chris. And maybe we could leave the last few minutes for any questions that anyone from the audience might have. Yeah, I also have a Q&A slide. Thanks. If there aren't any other questions, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining the session. I've also put my contact details on chat with a few links of what we've been talking about. So please feel free to reach out to us if you want. And we're always looking for new terms. So if there, like we mentioned, you don't really have to be an expert to be able to contribute. It can be anyone who knows the language. So that's it from my end. I think we can bring a close to the session.
Yes, thank you. I'll just say thank you as well to everyone. We appreciate your participation today.